History demonstrates a recurring phenomenon, a complete societal reset, not merely a reformation, which has occurred 5 times over the past 2 millennia, each instance involving the total obliteration of debts through hyperinflation, a jubilee, or armed conflict. This pattern manifested in ancient Rome in 33 AD, medieval Europe in 1347, revolutionary France in 1789, Weimar Germany in 1923, and post-war Europe in 1953. Despite the 5 distinct methods employed, the trajectory consistently followed an identical 6-stage sequence, culminating in the absolute annulment of debt. In each historical case, the debt initially appeared manageable. Leaders invariably pledged its repayment. Mathematicians consistently proved its impossibility. Yet the debt was eradicated regardless, decimating the accumulated wealth of ordinary citizens and orchestrating a redistribution of assets on a scale that dwarfs the financial prowess of today's billionaires. Currently, in the year 2025, the global debt burden has reached 335% of gross domestic product, translating to $300 trillion in total liabilities against an annual global economic output of $90 trillion. The United States alone carries a $36 trillion debt, while student loans stand at $1.7 trillion, auto loans at $1.6 trillion, credit card debt at $1.2 trillion, and corporate debt at $11 trillion. Repayment of this colossal sum is mathematically unfeasible. We are presently situated in stage 3 of this 6-stage pattern, a sequence that has unfolded 5 times previously, and historical precedent indicates that stages 4, 5, and 6 will follow with metronomic precision. The sole uncertainty lies in whether this reset will manifest as hyperinflation, rendering currency valueless, a government-mandated jubilee, liquidating creditors, or a war, physically dismantling enough of the system to render debts irrelevant. This is not a prophetic declaration, but an observation of recurring patterns. I will elucidate how this transpired 5 times before, why it is reoccurring now, and its implications for every dollar you possess, every obligation you hold, and every asset you believe you own. Before delving into historical examples, it is imperative to comprehend the nature of a debt jubilee and why it is an inescapable mathematical imperative rather than a discretionary policy choice. A debt jubilee entails the complete or partial cancellation of debts across an entire economy, not as an act of governmental benevolence, but because the alternative is absolute systemic collapse. When indebtedness reaches a level where its repayment is mathematically impossible, a breaking point is inevitable. Either the debt vanishes or the economy perishes. This phenomenon arises because debt represents a claim on future productivity. When one borrows $100,000, one implicitly commits to generating sufficient future economic value to repay that $100,000 plus interest. When a government incurs $36 trillion in debt, it pledges that future taxpayers will produce enough to satisfy that obligation. However, there is a finite limit. When debt surpasses an economy's productive capacity, when interest payments consume all economic growth, and when new borrowing is required merely to service interest on existing debt, the system devolves into a Ponzi scheme. Like all such schemes, it is ultimately destined for collapse. The arithmetic is straightforward. If global GDP is $90 trillion and expands at 3% annually, this equates to $2.7 trillion in new production each year. Yet global debt totals $300 trillion. If the average interest rate is a mere 3%, this demands $9 trillion in annual interest payments. The economy generates $2.7 trillion in new value, while the debt requires $9 trillion in payments. This is mathematically unsustainable. Upon reaching this juncture, the debt must be eliminated, not merely restructured or refinanced, but eradicated. History reveals only 3 methods for this outcome. Method 1, hyperinflation, wherein the government prints unlimited currency. Debts are repaid with worthless money, creditors are wiped out, and savers are destroyed. Method 2, jubilee, where the government declares debts cancelled. Creditors lose everything, debtors are liberated, but the financial system collapses and necessitates reconstruction. Method 3, war, involving widespread destruction of physical capital, millions of casualties, and sufficient chaos to render debts unenforceable and immaterial. Every historical debt crisis has been resolved through one of these 3 mechanisms. A 4th option does not exist, because when mathematics dictates that debt cannot be repaid, reality enforces that mathematical truth, irrespective of political promises. Now I will outline the 6-stage pattern that consistently leads to this outcome. Stage 1 is credit expansion creating a prosperity illusion. Every debt crisis commences identically with easily accessible credit fostering an appearance of prosperity. Individuals borrow and spend, spurring economic growth. Governments cite this growth as evidence of productive debt, but it is not genuine prosperity. It is borrowing from the future. Ancient Rome, 10 to 30 AD. Following Augustus's establishment of the empire, Roman credit markets experienced explosive growth. Affluent patricians extended loans to plebeians, merchants, and even fellow patricians. The Senate sanctioned massive public works, such as aqueducts, roads, and forums, all financed through borrowing. The Roman elite engaged in competitive extravagance, with senators borrowing to fund gladiatorial spectacles and governors borrowing to secure positions through bribery. The economy appeared to be thriving, characterized by increased construction, trade, and the influx of luxury goods into Rome from across the empire. However, this growth was illusory. The construction did not generate productive capacity. The games did not create wealth. The borrowing failed to fund innovation or infrastructure that would yield returns. Instead, it financed consumption, bread and circuses, entertainment and spectacle. By 20 AD, private debt in Rome had escalated to levels where most patrician families were borrowing simply to maintain appearances, owing enormous sums to creditors. Yet sustained spending was possible as long as new loans remained available. Medieval Europe, 1300 to 1340. Following the agricultural boom of the High Middle Ages, credit became broadly accessible. Italian banking houses including the Bardi, Peruzzi, and Medici lent to monarchs, nobles, merchants, and even the church. Kings borrowed to finance wars. The Hundred Years' War between England and France was largely underwritten by Italian loans. Edward III of England borrowed over 1.5 million florins from Italian bankers, an amount equivalent to billions today. This credit expansion created apparent prosperity. Trade flourished, cathedral construction accelerated, and universities were founded. Beneath this veneer, however, debts accumulated. Kings were borrowing to repay previous loans, and the Bardi and Peruzzi banks had extended so much credit to European monarchs that they were critically exposed to sovereign default risk. Revolutionary France, 1700 to 1785. After Louis XIV's wars, France was deeply indebted. Rather than implementing austerity, his successors borrowed more. Louis XV financed wars in Austria, Poland, and the 7 Years' War through borrowing. Louis XVI inherited debts whose interest payments alone consumed 50% of government revenue. Yet the economy seemed robust. Paris was Europe's cultural capital. The nobility lived lavishly, and Versailles hosted extravagant parties. Credit continued to flow, predicated on the assumption that France, Europe's wealthiest nation, could always secure additional loans. Weimar Germany, 1918 to 1921. Following World War I, Germany faced reparations payments mandated by the Treaty of Versailles, 132 billion gold marks, an impossible sum. The German government began borrowing domestically to make these payments, fund reconstruction, and avert the political unpopularity of raising taxes. The economy initially recovered, with falling unemployment and increased production. This credit expansion generated jobs and growth, but it was entirely debt-financed. The money was not real. It represented future claims on production that Germany could not possibly deliver. Post-World War II, Western world, 1950 to 1980. After the war, the Western world embarked on the largest credit expansion in history. The United States enacted the GI Bill, subsidizing housing, education, and business loans for millions of veterans. Europe received Marshall Plan aid, much of it extended as credit. This credit fueled the post-war boom, leading to the fastest economic growth in history and soaring living standards. Governments could borrow cheaply due to high growth and low inflation, and prosperity seemed permanent. However, this was stage one, the credit expansion that creates an illusion, the borrowing that feels like growth. And stage one invariably leads to stage two. Stage two is debt reaching 250% plus of GDP. At some juncture, borrowing surpasses a critical threshold, which economists have identified as approximately 250% of GDP, representing total debt relative to economic output. Once debt exceeds this level, growth begins to decelerate as resources are diverted from productive investment to debt service. Ancient Rome, 30 to 33 AD. By the early 30s AD, under Emperor Tiberius, private debt in Rome had reached unsustainable levels. While an exact GDP ratio is not calculable, contemporary accounts describe debt levels as widespread and oppressive. Senators owed millions of sesterces, merchants were unable to repay loans, and even affluent families were technically insolvent. The entire Roman economy was leveraged beyond its productive capacity. Medieval Europe, 1340 to 1345. By 1340, European sovereign debt had reached crisis proportions. Edward III of England owed Italian banks more than his kingdom's entire annual revenue, and France carried similar burdens. The banking houses were exposed to defaults exceeding 10 times their capital reserves. The credit market began to seize up, banks ceased lending, and interest rates surged. Kings who had easily borrowed for decades suddenly found no new creditors. Revolutionary France, 1780 to 1788. By 1788, France's debt consumed 60% of government revenue solely for interest payments. Total debt was estimated at 300% of annual government income, not GDP, but government revenue, which constituted perhaps 10% of the economy. This implies a potential GDP debt ratio of 30%, enormous for the 18th century. The government attempted further borrowing, but creditors grew apprehensive. Interest rates rose, increasing borrowing costs, which in turn demanded an even larger portion of revenue for interest payments. Weimar Germany, 1921 to 1922. By 1921, Germany's total debt, encompassing domestic and reparations obligations, surpassed 400% of GDP. Reparations alone amounted to 132 billion gold marks, while Germany's annual GDP was approximately 30 billion marks. This debt was insurmountable. The government continued to borrow from the Reichsbank, Germany's central bank, to meet payments, but the debt grew faster than the economy. Stage 2 was complete. Modern global economy, 2008 to 2020. The 2008 financial crisis propelled global debt from 200% of GDP to 250% by 2010. Instead of deleveraging, governments and corporations borrowed more. By 2020, prior to the pandemic, global debt had reached 320% of GDP. Then, the pandemic struck. Governments printed $17 trillion in emergency spending globally. By 2022, total global debt reached 350% of GDP. We crossed the 250% threshold in 2010 and have only accelerated since. Specifically, in the United States, federal debt stands at 120% of GDP, corporate debt at 45%, household debt at 75%, and financial sector debt at another 80%, totaling over 320% of GDP. We are deeply entrenched in Stage 2. Stage 3 is interest payments consuming all growth. This is the point where the mathematics become undeniable. When interest payments on existing debt absorb all new economic growth, the system becomes ensnared in a debt trap. Any additional borrowing only exacerbates the trap. Ancient Rome, 33 AD. By the year 33 AD, Roman creditors demanded repayment, but debtors were unable to comply. The entire credit system froze. No new loans were issued, and existing loans were called in. Commerce decelerated, and land prices plummeted as no one could borrow to acquire property. Interest on accumulated debts consumed the productive output of the empire. Wealth flowed from debtors to creditors, but debtors lacked the means to generate sufficient wealth for repayment. Medieval Europe, 1345. In 1345, Edward III of England defaulted on his debts to the Bardi and Peruzzi banks, simply ceasing payments. The banks, having lent beyond their entire capital base, collapsed. The Bardi Bank failed completely, followed by the Peruzzi Bank. The credit freeze propagated across Europe. Without Italian banking, there was no source of international credit. Trade collapsed. Interest payments on remaining debts consumed the revenues of every kingdom, and growth ceased. Revolutionary France, 1788. In 1788, France allocated 60% of government revenue to interest payments, not to the military or administration, but to interest. The kingdom was borrowing merely to service interest on prior loans, the very definition of a Ponzi scheme. King Louis XVI convened the Assembly of Notables to approve new taxes for debt repayment, but the nobles refused, unwilling to bail out a government they perceived as corrupt and incompetent. The king attempted to impose the taxes, which ultimately led to revolution. Weimar Germany, 1922 to 1923. By 1922, Germany's reparations, domestic debt interest, and reconstruction costs exceeded government revenue. The sole means of making payments was to print money. The Reichsbank began operating its printing presses continuously. Inflation commenced slowly, then accelerated. Prices doubled, then doubled again. The currency lost value faster than the government could print it. Savings were annihilated, yet debts remained denominated in gold marks, meaning they grew in real terms even as paper marks became worthless. Modern global economy, 2020 to 2025. The United States currently expends approximately $900 billion annually on interest payments, exceeding the defense budget and approaching $1 trillion per year, even at relatively low interest rates. If rates revert to historical averages, interest payments could reach $1.5 trillion. US GDP grows perhaps $500 to $700 billion annually in real terms. Interest payments are consuming over 100% of real growth. Every new dollar of economic output is directed towards servicing interest on old debts. This is stage 3, the debt trap. We are here right now. Stage 4 is the system becoming unpayable mathematically. Stage 4 marks the realization, the moment when anyone capable of basic arithmetic comprehends that the debt will never be repaid, not due to unwillingness, but because the numbers simply do not add up. This is when creditors begin demanding payment, debtors start defaulting, and the system begins to fracture. Ancient Rome, 33 AD. In the year 33 AD, the crisis became undeniable. The Senate had enacted a law requiring 2/3 of every creditor's capital to be invested in Italian land, an attempt to bolster land prices. However, no one wished to lend for land purchases. Debtors unable to repay faced prosecution, and prisons overflowed with them. The crisis climaxed when prominent patrician families, including senators, were exposed as insolvent, owing more than they possessed. The Roman elite was bankrupt. The debt was mathematically unpayable. Medieval Europe, 1347. Following the Bardi and Peruzzi collapse in 1345, European monarchs attempted to restructure their debts, promising partial payments, extended timelines, and offering collateral. Yet the math remained intractable. England's annual revenue was £100,000, while Edward III owed 900,000 florins, roughly equivalent to £1.5 million. Even dedicating 100% of revenue for 15 years would not cover it. The realization spread. The debt would never be repaid. Creditors ceased expecting payment and wrote off the loans. The system was functionally bankrupt. Revolutionary France, 1789. By 1789, France's debt, including interest and basic government operations, consumed 100% of tax revenue. The figures were public, making it evident to all that even if France abolished its military, ceased all public works, and dismissed every government employee, the debt could still not be paid. Jacques Necker, the finance minister, published these figures in an attempt to compel tax reform. Instead, it demonstrated the system's insolvency. The debt could not be paid. The Third Estate demanded the government default, but the aristocracy refused, as they were the creditors. Weimar Germany, 1923. By mid-1923, the Weimar government was printing trillions of marks daily. The currency was worthless. A loaf of bread cost billions of marks. Workers demanded to be paid twice daily to spend their earnings before they depreciated further. However, the debt remained denominated in gold, and reparations were still due in gold marks. Germany would have had to generate more value than its entire economy just to pay interest on these gold-denominated debts. It was an impossibility, known to everyone, creditors and debtors alike. Modern global economy, 2025. Currently, mathematicians, economists, and anyone with a calculator can discern that present debt levels are unpayable. The U.S. would require budget surpluses of $1 trillion annually for 36 consecutive years to extinguish the national debt while simultaneously meeting $1 trillion in annual interest payments. This would necessitate 50% tax increases or 70% spending cuts, neither of which is politically viable. Global debt of $300 trillion would demand repayment exceeding 3 years of total global economic output, while also providing for people's livelihoods, government operations, and business functions. The math does not work. We are in stage 4, the recognition. Anyone examining the numbers understands that this does not conclude with repayment. Stage 5 is political pressure for a reset building. Once stage 4 is reached, once everyone acknowledges the debt's unpayable nature, Political pressure for a reset intensifies. Debtors clamor for a jubilee, while creditors demand protection. The government finds itself trapped between two impossible positions, and the social contract begins to unravel. Ancient Rome, 33 AD. Roman plebeians, the common populace, began demanding debt relief. Debtors' prisons overflowed, and families were sold into slavery to satisfy debts. Plebeian tribunes, representing the common people, urged the Senate to cancel all debts. The patricians, who were the creditors, refused, as cancellation would obliterate their wealth. The Senate was deadlocked. Riots erupted in Rome, with mobs attacking the residences of known creditors. Political pressure was escalating towards an explosive climax. Medieval Europe, 1347 to 1350. Following the banking collapse, European debtors sought release from their obligations. Merchants who had borrowed from the defunct Italian banks argued their debts expired with the banks. Nobles indebted to kings refused payment, asserting that the kings themselves were in default. However, another event soon overshadowed the debt crisis. The Black Death arrived in 1347. Within 3 years, 30 to 50% of Europe's population perished. The plague claimed both creditors and debtors. Labor became scarce, wages rose, and debts became unenforceable due to the lack of people to collect them. The plague effectively cancelled the debt through death and chaos. Stages 5 and 6 occurred simultaneously. Revolutionary France, 1789. The political pressure for debt relief in France culminated in revolution. The Third Estate, representing 98% of the population, demanded the monarchy default on debts owed to aristocrats and foreign creditors, arguing that these debts had been incurred by corrupt monarchs for wars benefiting only the elite. The aristocracy refused, as they were the creditors, demanding higher taxes from the peasants to honor the debts. This was the central conflict of the French Revolution. Debtors versus creditors, poor versus rich, a conflict that would be resolved with violence. Weimar Germany, 1923. By late 1923, the German populace demanded that the government cease reparations payments and stop printing money. Workers went on strike. Communist and Nazi parties gained traction by promising to cancel debts. Adolf Hitler attempted a coup, the Beer Hall Putsch, in November 1923, explicitly campaigning on a platform of refusing reparations. The political pressure was overwhelming. The government could not pay the debts and maintain domestic order. Something had to yield. Modern global economy, 2020 to 2025. Currently, political movements across both the left and right advocate for debt relief, including student loan forgiveness, mortgage forbearance, corporate debt restructuring, and sovereign debt jubilee for developing nations. The left contends that debts are predatory, that lenders exploited borrowers, and that the wealthy should absorb losses. The right argues that inflation is theft, that central banks debase the currency, and that savers are being destroyed. Both sides demand intervention. Politicians are responding with student loan forgiveness programs, expanded unemployment benefits, and stimulus checks, all forms of indirect debt relief via government transfer payments. But it is insufficient. The pressure is mounting. Stage 5 is currently unfolding. Stage 6 is reset via hyperinflation, jubilee, or war. This is the conclusion, the stage where debt is eliminated not through repayment, but through destruction. The method varies, but the outcome is consistently the same. Creditors are wiped out, savers are destroyed, wealth is transferred on a massive scale, and the economy must rebuild from its remnants. Ancient Rome, 33 AD, government intervention, partial jubilee. Facing the political crisis, Emperor Tiberius acted. He released 100 million sesterces from the imperial treasury as interest-free loans to debtors for 3 years. This enabled debtors to repay creditors using government funds. Effectively, the government absorbed the private debt, transferring imperial wealth to resolve the debt crisis. The treasury was depleted, and the relief was temporary. Within a few decades, Roman debts resurfaced. The cycle would repeat under subsequent emperors with currency debasement. Roman emperors began reducing the silver content in denarius coins. By 200 AD, the denarius was 50% silver. By 300 AD, less than 5%. The currency was debased to inflate away debts. This exemplifies Method 1. Inflation, debasement, debts repaid in worthless currency. Medieval Europe, 1347 to 1350, death and collapse, war, plague. The Black Death claimed 30 to 50% of Europe's population. The debt crisis was resolved through mortality. Creditors died, debtors died. Survivors inherited property, but there was no one to enforce debt collection. Labor scarcity drove wages up. Serfs in debt bondage abandoned their lords. The feudal system weakened. The debts existing in 1347 were effectively cancelled by 1350, not through policy, but through apocalypse. This illustrates method 3. Catastrophic destruction renders debts irrelevant. Revolutionary France, 1789 to 1794. Hyperinflation, assignats. The French Revolution commenced with the National Assembly seizing church lands, approximately 10% of all land in France. They issued paper currency called assignats, backed by this land, intended to settle government debts. Initially, it succeeded. Assignats were accepted, and the government paid creditors with land-backed paper. However, they printed more and more. By 1792, assignats in circulation exceeded the value of the seized land backing them. Inflation began. Prices doubled, then quadrupled. By 1794, assignats had lost 99% of their value. A single gold louis, worth 20 assignats in 1790, was worth 3,000 assignats by 1794. The debts were annihilated. Anyone who had lent money to the French government lost everything. The currency became worthless. This is method 1, hyperinflation. The debt was paid, but with worthless paper. Weimar Germany, 1923, hyperinflation. In November 1923, hyperinflation peaked. The Reichsbank was printing 500 quintillion marks daily. A single US dollar was worth 4.2 trillion marks. Prices doubled every few days. Workers were paid in wheelbarrows of cash, which they spent immediately because by the next day it would be worth half as much. Savings accounts became valueless. A lifetime of savings could not purchase a loaf of bread. But the debts were wiped out. Anyone who owed money repaid it in worthless marks. Mortgages, business loans, personal debts, all erased. The losers were creditors, savers, and bondholders. The middle class was destroyed. In December 1923, Germany introduced a new currency, the Rentenmark, backed by land and industrial assets. One Rentenmark equaled 1 trillion old marks. The old currency was declared worthless. The slate was wiped clean. This is method 1, hyperinflation, total debt erasure through currency destruction. Post-World War II. Europe, 1945 to 1953, negotiated Jubilee, London Debt Agreement. After World War II, Germany, now West Germany, carried immense debts from war reparations, reconstruction loans, and pre-war obligations. The total was estimated at over 30 billion marks, exceeding Germany's GDP. The Allies, led by the United States, convened the London Debt Agreement in 1953. They negotiated a 50% reduction in Germany's debts. Half the debt was simply cancelled. The remaining half was restructured with very low interest rates and long repayment terms tied to Germany's capacity to pay. This was a jubilee. Creditor nations agreed to absorb losses to facilitate Germany's rebuilding. The US, UK, and France wrote off billions. The debt was halved by agreement. Why? Because they learned from Weimar. Crushing debt loads led to hyperinflation, extremism, and war. The London Debt Agreement aimed to prevent another Hitler by making Germany's debts payable. This is method 2, negotiated jubilee. Creditors incur losses, debts are cancelled, the system is reset. Let's map these 6 stages to today's United States and the global economy. Stage 1, credit expansion creates prosperity illusion. 1980 to 2008, the Great Moderation. Credit cards, mortgages, student loans, corporate debt, and sovereign debt all expanded massively. The economy grew, living standards rose. It appeared to be prosperity. It was leverage. Check. Completed. Stage 2, debt reaches 250% plus of GDP, 2008 to 2020. The financial crisis pushed global debt to 250% of GDP by 2010. Instead of deleveraging, governments borrowed more. By 2020, debt was 320% of GDP. The pandemic pushed it to 350%. Check. Completed. Stage 3, interest payments consume all growth. 2020 to 2025. U.S. interest payments are approaching $1 trillion annually. Global interest on $300 trillion of debt at a 3% average rate equals $9 trillion annually. Global GDP. Growth equals $2.7 trillion. The math does not work. Check. We are here right now. Stage 4. System becomes unpayable mathematically. 2023 to 2025. Anyone with a calculator can see the debt will not be repaid. $36 trillion in federal debt, plus over $100 trillion in unfunded liabilities, Social Security, Medicare. Total U.S. debt exceeds 320% of GDP. Global debt is 335% of GDP. Check. Recognition is spreading. Stage 5 political pressure for reset builds. 2020 to 2025. Political movements on both the left and right advocate for debt relief. Student loan forgiveness. Calls for wealth taxes. Modern monetary theory. Advocates claiming debt is irrelevant. Crypto advocates predicting fiat currency doom. Gold bugs forecasting collapse. Both political parties promise spending without a repayment plan. Check. Pressure is building. Stage 6. Reset via hyperinflation, jubilee, or war. Coming. We have not yet reached Stage 6, but Stages 1 through 5 are either complete or nearing completion. History indicates that Stage 6 follows within 3 to 7 years of reaching Stage 3. We entered Stage 3 in 2020. This implies Stage 6 could arrive between 2023 and 2027. We might already be in its early phase. Based on the historical pattern, we can predict the most probable method. Method 1. Hyperinflation. This is the most likely path for the United States. Not immediate Weimar-style hyperinflation, but high, persistent inflation, 10 to 20% annually for a decade. This gradually erases the real value of debts while maintaining the fiction of repayment. The government does not technically default. They repay the $36 trillion debt, but with dollars worth 50 to 70% less than today. Creditors lose purchasing power, and savers are destroyed. But technically, the debt was repaid. We have already witnessed its inception. 2021 to 2022 saw 7 to 9% inflation. Real inflation, using 1980s methodology, was 15% plus. This is the beginning of Method 1. Method 2, Jubilee. Less likely in the US due to the requirement for political consensus, but we are observing partial jubilees. Student loan forgiveness represents a jubilee for $1.7 trillion in debt. If this extends to mortgages, auto loans, and credit cards, it becomes a broader jubilee. Globally, there is discussion of jubilee for developing nations, such as over $300 billion in African debt to China. If China forgives it, which is unlikely, that constitutes a jubilee. More probable is coordinated default, which functions similarly. Method 3. War. The darkest option. A major conflict potentially involving the US, China, and Russia that destroys sufficient physical capital and eliminates enough creditors to render debts unenforceable. This is how World War II effectively reset Europe's debts. Let us hope this does not transpire. However, historically, when debts become unpayable and political systems are deadlocked, war has served as the resolution mechanism more often than we would prefer to acknowledge. The most probable scenario is a combination. High inflation, Method 1, coupled with selective jubilees, student loans, some mortgages, and regional conflicts, not World War II, but ongoing instability, that slowly erode the debt over 10 to 20 years. When the reset occurs, and it is inevitable, ordinary individuals will lose wealth in 3 ways. First, savings. If the reset is via inflation, cash loses purchasing power. $100,000 in savings becomes $50,000 in purchasing power. Bonds become worthless. Treasury bills return 4% while inflation is 15%, resulting in an 11% annual loss. Second, fixed incomes. Retirees on pensions, Social Security, and fixed annuities all lose. Payments remain the same but purchase half as much. A $3,000 per month pension becomes $1,500 in real terms. Third, creditors. If you have lent money, purchase bonds, or hold funds in money market accounts, you lose. The debt is repaid in devalued currency. You receive 100 cents on the dollar, but each dollar buys half of what it once did. However, some individuals will benefit. Debtors win. If you owe money, especially fixed-rate debt, you win. Your mortgage payment remains constant while your income inflates. You repay $300,000 over 30 years, but by year 30, that $300,000 is worth $150,000 in today's money. You effectively receive a 50% discount. Owners of hard assets win. Real estate, commodities, gold, productive businesses. These maintain value across currency resets. A house is a house, whether priced in dollars, marks, francs, or assignats. Its value derives from its utility, not its denomination. Those who foresee it coming win. This is the most crucial point. If you comprehend the pattern, you can position yourself before the reset. You hold assets that withstand currency destruction. You avoid holding cash or bonds that will be inflated away. You strategically incur fixed-rate debt that inflation will erase, based on the historical pattern. Here's what you should consider. 1. Minimize cash holdings. Do not hold large amounts of cash or cash-equivalent assets like money market funds, as these will be destroyed by inflation. Retain only what is necessary for 3 to 6 months of expenses. 2. Convert to hard assets. Real estate, especially income-producing real estate. Commodities such as gold, silver, agricultural land, and productive businesses that generate cash flow. These assets survive currency resets. 3. Strategic debt. This is controversial, but consider taking on fixed-rate debt to acquire assets. A 30-year mortgage at 6% is a boon if inflation runs 10 to 15% for the next decade. You are borrowing money that will inflate away while the asset appreciates. 4. Watch the indicators. Track real inflation using independent sources like shadow stats. Monitor bond yields. If 10-year Treasury yields spike above 6 to 7%, that signals creditors demanding higher returns due to perceived inflation risk. That is an indication we are entering stage 6. 5. Do not assume you have 10 years. The pattern suggests 3 to 7 years from stage 3 to stage 6. We entered stage 3 in 2020. This means stage 6 could arrive between 2023 and 2027, or it might accelerate and occur by 2025 to 2026. Historical patterns tend to accelerate as they approach conclusion. Be early, not merely on time. 5 times in 2,000 years, debt has reached unpayable levels. 5 times the debt was reset. Ancient Rome bailed out debtors and debased its currency. Medieval Europe's debts were erased by plague. Revolutionary France printed assignats into worthlessness. Weimar Germany hyperinflated away debts in 1 year. Post-war Europe negotiated a 50% jubilee. Each time the method differed, but the pattern remained consistent. 6 stages from credit expansion to debt erasure. And each time those who understood the pattern positioned themselves before its completion. They held hard assets. They avoided being creditors. They survived and prospered while others lost everything. Right now, global debt stands at 335% of GDP, totaling $300 trillion. Interest payments are consuming all growth. The debt is mathematically unpayable. We are in stage 3, transitioning to stages 4 and 5. Stage 6 is imminent. The only question is whether you will recognize the pattern before its completion, or whether you will be holding cash, bonds, and savings accounts when the reset occurs. History is unequivocally clear about what transpires next. The debt is not repaid. It is erased through inflation, jubilee, or war. And when it is, wealth transfers from creditors to debtors, from savers to hard asset owners, from those who believe the promises to those who comprehend the mathematics. The pattern has unfolded 5 times, and it is unfolding again right now. 6 stages. We are in stage 3, and stages 4, 5, and 6 will follow with the inevitability of gravity. If this has altered your perception of debt, savings, and impending events, you are beginning to grasp the pattern. 5 times it played out. 2,000 years of history, and it is happening again. Subscribe if you wish to track the progression from stage 3 to stage 6, because when the reset arrives, you will want to have understood it before it happened.